So these are going to be the top 10 best decks for Legend. This is going to be my last tier list before the new expansion comes out, because if you haven't already started saving your dust and gold, you probably should start. But if you want to hit Legend before the new expansion comes out, these are the decks to do it with. First, we have Undead Priest. It's just the best deck in the game right now, unless you get to the highest ranks of play where Miracle Rogue really starts to shine. This deck has very few weaknesses. If your board gets wiped, you have a lot of death rattles that can do things. If your board gets wiped, you also have ways of resummoning minions that died with the Animate Dead, as well as the High Cultist. You also have a cool little combo with Astalar and Void Touched Attendant when you get to turn 10, which means every time it hits your opponent's face, it does 1 extra damage. It basically doubles the amount of damage, which can be a great way to finish off some control decks. Overall, this deck has very few weak points, and if you don't have an Ajax, that's okay. Would not recommend crafting him at this point. Just put in something like a Banshee for some early game. Next, moving on, we have Imp Warlock. Imp Warlock and Curse Imp Warlock are basically the same deck in my opinion. Both of them will be in the description. But the general idea is you want to dominate the early game with your imps, snowball as hard as you can, and then finish off your opponent with big pumps from the Shady Bartender, Imp King Rafam, and No Fins Impossible. That's not necessarily like a stat pump, but it makes your board more sticky, and it's just very hard for any deck to deal with. I mean, just imagine having a board of 1/1 and 3/3 imps that your opponent basically has to wipe twice. It's really hard. If you are running the Curse deck, though, it doesn't rely as heavily on the imps. You rely on the curses basically to win the game in the late game. That deck list is a little bit better in a slower meta with more control decks. Really depends on what you're going up against. Next, we have Frost Aggro Death Knight. This deck, as well as Unholy Death Knight, I will get to that in a second, are very similar. Generally, you want to just pump out some early undead minions, get them out on the board. You want to create 4 or 5 rush minions using the Construct Quarter, ideally on the Foul Egg to also get a 3/3 chicken. And then later on in the game, you want to finish off your opponent with direct damage with the Mare Manipulator, the Overseer Frigidara, and then Frost Worm Fury. You also have a couple of ways of discovering spells like the Nerubian Visor, which is just another great way to get some direct damage. Then you have a couple of weapons. Bonebreaker is absolutely broken. It kills off minions while also doing damage to the opponent. It's really, really good. Next, we have Pure Paladin. This is the deck list that I recommend to basically everybody who is just starting out with the game. You don't even need the Purator if you don't happen to have it. The deck will run just fine without it. Maybe just run another Order in the Court, or take it out and put in the Blood Crusader. So that way you have a way of cheating out the Countess a little bit earlier. This is the deck that I recommend the most, though, because it's so simple. Basically, you just want to play tempo, play whatever the best card you can on any given turn is, pump up minions on the board if you can with Seal of Blood, and then you have some fun with some random legendary generation. It's actually a pretty fun deck. It's not the most fun, obviously, but the Countess is a pretty fun card. The deck is very easy to play, and it's, in my opinion, the best deck for beginners, except for maybe Imp Warlock. Next, we have Unholy Death Knight, which, honestly, the way I was talking about the Frost Death Knight before, it's basically the same thing, except it's a little bit more board focused. You can't necessarily kill over the top, but it snowballs harder and can end games a little bit faster with Grave Strength. So it really depends on what your playstyle is, right? Do you want to have a decent board and then burn your opponent down? Or do you want to have a really good early game and then win with the board that you have using Grave Strength? Also, you can snowball very quickly with Hawkstride Rancher. And then you have Lord Merogar, which is just a great card to finish off your opponent late game, especially if they just used a big removal to kill your existing board. Drop this, you can usually win the game off of it. Next, we're going into the Fel Demon Hunter. This is a list that I think is actually very, very good. I don't really understand why people don't play it a little bit more. It's just, I think it's because it's a little bit overplayed, honestly, and it doesn't have that big of a board state, so it can feel kind of boring to play. But let me tell you, when you actually combo off with this deck, it is insane. The spell damage from Guild Trader with the Jace Darkweaver, or potentially with the Unleash Fel on turn 6, can be a great way to wipe the board and heal basically all the way back up to full. The relics are just great ways of snowballing on each other. I like that little synergy. It makes the deck feel like it's just more cohesive. And then you also have ways of discovering random cards with the Nerubian Vizier and School Teacher to get you out of sticky situations. And again, you have Jace, Artificer, and Kurtrus as all viable late game win conditions. So even if one of them gets eaten or stolen, or you don't infuse the Artificer Zymox all the way, you have other viable win conditions. I've won multiple games after losing each one of these at least once. Next, we're going on to Big Spell Mage. Big Spell Mage is the deck on this list that I think has the most glaring weakness, and that is it gets absolutely obliterated by aggro. Yes, you have some decent tempo cards and you can survive, especially if you have like Coin, Barbaric Sorceress on 5, but if you're playing against a hard aggro deck, you don't really have that much removal, so if you have a slightly slow start, you're just going to lose. That being said, if you have a good start, and you can survive to turn 5 or 6, this deck just blows everything away. You're going to get insane value out of Drakefire Amulet and Rune of the Archmage, and then you're able to infinitely scale with Magister Dawngrasp in some niche situations like some control decks. It's a pretty good deck. Next, we have Quest Druid. This is a deck that starts getting better in higher ranks as you figure out how to ramp and gauge what risk you're taking versus when you need to remove the board. This is a deck that I ended up going like 5-1 with real quick. I don't really like playing Ramp Druid that much. I'm kind of just annoyed with Guff in general at this point, but it's a very good deck, and if you want to play something like Ramp Druid, this is the best way to do that. The quest gives you some added survivability. It gives you basically 10 armor, a draw card, and then a 5-mana minion that can help you stay alive in situations. It can be a decent win condition, but usually you're going for a Nubricon, Bran, and Astalar as your OTK win condition, which you can usually get off between turns 7 and 9, depending on how much ramp you get and if you get Guff or Innervate. And you need 11 mana to do the combo. One last thing, you need 11 mana to do the combo if you've already played the 2-mana Astalar beforehand. So even if you don't have Guff, if you have Innervate, you play Bran, you play a Nubricon after you play Innervate, that's 11 mana, then you play Astalar, and you should be fine. Next, we have Miracle Rogue. This is the best deck in High Legend right now, and it's actually good in like Medium Legend as well, because people really know how to play a lot of cards really quickly, and this deck is not for new players or even players in like low diamond. I would not recommend this deck. It's extremely difficult to play. You gotta figure out 7 cards in advance before you even start a turn. You need to have exactly what you want to play. You need to play things quickly. You need to discover your concoctions quickly on high impact turns in order to get the biggest minions possible off of the Sinstone Graveyard and the Necrolord Draka. Very important, very difficult deck, but if you know what you're doing, this is the best deck in the game right now, at least in high elo. And then the last deck on the list is going to be Thief Rogue. It's a very popular deck that doesn't actually have the highest win rate, but that is not 100% the case. You can't judge everything based off of stats. I think that the deck is still very solid. You just need to know what to discover off of things like the Tooth and Nefarian, and you need to be very flexible with the cards you get off of Jackpot, because sometimes you'll get cards that seem bad, but in reality, they actually have the potential to be fairly good. So I would recommend playing this deck if you want to have fun a little bit more than you want to win, but this deck definitely can still win games, and it's very popular right now in the ladder. So sorry for the slightly worse editing or no editing. I'm going to be in Vegas this weekend when I normally post my tier list. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and again, if you don't have like a lot of cards, say you're missing Tess, Scabs, and Astalar, honestly, just craft Astalar and play a different deck, because it's not worth it to craft a ton of legendaries, especially legendaries that are probably leaving soon, like Tess and Scabs. So save your dust, save your gold, but if you have most of the cards, try out some of these decks. Hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you in the next one.